Okay, now in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to create a mixed media drawing in a number of different types. So you'll notice with this example here, there's a watercolor wash, there are elements of collage, which combines all of these different elements. So to begin, I'm going to start off with a watercolor wash. Now, what I suggest you do, basically when you're drawing, is that you stick to neutral colors. Right now, okay, now when your surface has dried, you are able now to begin the process of drawing over the top. Now I'm going to be using waterproof fine line pens, brush pen and a Sharpie pen. Also I'm going to be using some ink, drawing ink. The first stage really is, I would say, is just to establish a composition. Just think about where you want the main elements in your drawing to go. And starting with a light line, this is a waterproof pen, and it's going to allow me just to basically sketch in the main elements that we see here. Now, direct observation, looking at a secondary source, a photograph that I've taken. So it's really becoming accustomed to your subject matter, and this particular technique is interesting because it's the different types of elements: texture, tone, marking. So just working in, progressively adding more detail as the drawing progresses. Constantly referring back to your subject. I have a photograph, digital photograph next to me. Constantly looking at it, observing. So it's not drawing from memory, and it's certainly not an imaginative response. It's an observational response to the subject matter in front of me. So progressively adding the detail, adding the lines. Now this is a dormant tree through winter, so there's no leaves on this tree. It's just a framework of branches that we're trying to draw here. Hence the neutral background and then the neutral colours. So again, now progressively getting darker, starting to look at the shadows, dark areas, and emphasising the framework of the tree. It's always interesting, I think, with trees to focus on the negative spaces that the branches create, the spaces in between the branches, as well as the trunk of the tree itself. This, again, it will produce different types of marks and different types of shapes in your drawing. Try to have a variety of marks, holding the pen in different ways. So as well as that controlled line, and loosen up the lines as well, especially when you come to the finer details in the background. And vary the speed in which you produce these marks as well. If you tend to draw with the same speed and intensity of mark, the drawings will tend to look stiff and they'll lack expression. So vary the types of marks. Try to be conscious of the marks that you're creating on the page. Now, if you're interested in developing your drawing technique, check out some of my other videos on speed sketching and on continuous line drawing in the videos in the description below. So the framework of this tree now, the main branches have been drawn. The drawing at this point lacks detail. That's something we're going to remedy in a moment by adding more definite marks and texture to the image. Again, constantly referring back to the subject, looking at negative spaces. Don't be afraid to draw over marks that you've already created here, because I don't want you to erase anything. Every mark you make is a valid mark. And try and loosen up and become expressive. Okay, so the framework of the tree is now drawn, and we can now begin to be a bit more experimental, adding darker areas. As you'll notice with this example here, there are darker marks, thicker marks, and background elements. This really does allow you then to bring out the drawing. So focusing on the trunk of the tree, okay, just the addition of these background elements will add more depth to the drawing and place the drawing in some sort of context if it is a landscape scene. So now I'm going to basically focus on adding texture, mark making onto the subject. Now this particular subject or tree is a scene that I know quite well. I've photographed it on a number of occasions and I've also drawn it. So it is a subject that I'm aware of. A lot of these drawings are taken from scenes locally to me that I am familiar with. So I do have that sort of visual understanding of the subject over the years when I've visited these places. It's always good to go out, and it really will improve the kind of drawings that you produce if you draw on location. And you draw subjects that you are familiar with, that you know. Okay, now we have a variety of marks in this drawing. We have very fine outlines and areas using the brush pen and using the Sharpie. And I want to be a little bit more adventurous with this particular piece of work. So what I'm going to do is to work with a Pripet and to work with Indian ink now onto the surface, just to try and add a little bit more chance, a little bit more experimentation onto the surface. This really will create a far more interesting drawing, because it does create a much freer type of mark than you can create with the pen itself, or even with the pencil. There really is a combination of factors in this drawing. We're really focusing on the textures on the tree of the trunk. One of the interesting things about this subject are the textures of the tree. It's a cherry tree, and the trunk itself is lots of different types of natural textures on its surface, which make it quite an interesting subject to draw. So you'll notice here this really does create a far looser mark. It works pretty well with the other types of marks that are drawn previously in the image and the textures beneath it and the neutral surface. Now, if you're interested in creating experimental drawings and textures and surfaces, check out the link below in the description to check out some of my videos, which really will help you develop your drawing skills if you're interested in this particular type of technique. You'll find that ink goes a long way in a drawing like this. You don't usually need to refill these things. They're really good for fine lines, and just adding that sort of spontaneity and fluidity of line that many drawings tend to lack. Constantly referring back to your subject. Adding some horizontal elements just to balance out the vertical composition, create a sense of space behind the subject. At this point you can become quite expressive. This is a sort of interpretive response, expressive, but it's based on primary observation. I'm still looking at my subject whilst I'm drawing. I'm obviously trying to work in this sort of fluid fashion here. Okay, now another element that you can add to this is the use of a dip pen, a fountain pen, which again will give you very, very fine marks. Just interesting adding that level of detail, especially if you're interested in adding texture to your work. It's a really good way of doing it. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Possibly do a little bit more to this when it dries off. You could add some lighter highlights to it. So if you're interested in developing this type of technique, check out the link in the description below, and also my previous videos on continuous line drawing, speed drawing, gestural drawing. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.